Helena, Viramontes, the city of freeways. Here's a line from their dogs, passage from Their Dogs Came With Them. She looked out at her own house and all the other houses on grandfather's side of First Street. This is in Boyle Heights. The houses on the Save side were bright and ornamental like big Easter eggs on display at the Segunda store counter. Some of the houses had cluttered porches or hanging plants or yards with makeshift gardens. Others had parked cars on their front lawns. Some built wrought-iron gate fences, while others had drowsy curtains swaying in wide-open windows. In a few weeks, Chavela's side of the neighborhood, the dead side of the street, would disappear forever. The earthmovers had anchored, their tarps whipping like banging sails, their bellies petroleum-readied to bite trenches wider than rivers. In a few weeks, the blue house and all the other houses would vanish, just like Chavela and all the other neighbors. So this is Helena María Viramontes, and she was born February 26, 1954 in East LA. There it is. She's a graduate of Garfield High School. Anybody know that high school? Do you know about the Chicano blowouts? Tremendous uprising at this high school in the 60s and 70s that Viramontes writes about in Their Dogs Came With Them. But very profound. They objected to their treatment as students because they weren't getting educated. Oh, you remember that?
No, because that happened after I graduated 61.
Oh, okay.
So
That's right. It was later. But I didn't know about this until I did this research. This is amazing. Can you imagine a group of students in East LA rising up to demand better education? And they demanded it, and they sat down with the school board, and the school board did the school board thing, and they walked out because they were doing that bureaucratic bullshit, and they just said no. And it's debatable about what effects it had, but they were amazing. Viramontes was a part of that, and like I said, engages it a little bit in the novel. She got a BA from Immaculate Heart College. She is now a professor at Cornell in the creative writing department. So these are her publications. The Moths and Other Stories, short story writer. Under the Feet of Jesus, 1995. Their Dogs Came With Them, 2007. And The Cemetery Boys, which is about veterans, World War II veterans, is forthcoming. She traces her literary roots to age 10. Her father recalls that he and his wife, her mother, took a trip to Tijuana and left Helena María in charge of the family, and she was the fourth oldest. But she wrote down everything her siblings did. She recorded it, just wrote it all down. She was 10 years old. She wrote down every action they took, everything they said. So she had to be a writer or a narc, one of the other. And she says, in fact, writing, she says it tattooed my brain, writing did. Writing is the only way I know how to pray. She went to Cal State, LA. Next to one of the biggest barrios in the country, and while she was a student in the English department, she says she was told by a professor that she did not belong there because she was writing about Latina issues. We're going to hear her respond to that in a minute. Then at UCI, she moved on there in 79, and she was, again, criticized for what she was trying to do. She says this: I began writing my stories there until 1981, when a professor told me not to write about Chicanos, but to write about people. I know. He told me I was a cheap imitation of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. You'll hear her talk about this. I don't know if this line resonated with me, but if you've ever been betrayed by an institution or hurt by an institution, it may speak to you too. It drove her from the program, being told that, and she says, my stomach got sick whenever I passed the humanities building. We should do some talks about how we relate to institutions, because they never love you back. They never do. They're not designed to do that, except PRS, of course. Under the feet of Jesus in 1990, she returned to Irvine, to the Fine Arts program, and this amazing novel was accepted as her master's thesis and was published by Dutton. So success is the best revenge, right? And I'll talk more about this novel in a minute, but she wants her readers to know about the pescadores, the people who work in the farms. She says this, when people sit down to eat their salads or bite into their apples, I want them to think about the harvesters that brought that food to their table. And I guarantee you, if you read Under the Feet of Jesus, you will think about them a lot. So Wes, here's a little video. I kind of like this video. It's clearly done by a student who's like trying to, but it's got that very raw quality to it. And she's amazing, so here she is.
The trouble with your work. No, first of all, he called me a cheap imitation of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. But, I wasn't, the only thing that made me pissed was that he used the word cheap. Hey, okay, so if I'm a good imitation of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, gracias a Dios. Anyway, in fact, when I was at the Sundance Institute and I had a workshop with Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and I told him that story, and he started laughing. He says, "Oh, I can hardly wait till the time when people say that I'm a cheap imitation of Helena María Viramontes." He's a very sweet man. Anyway, going back, he told me, the trouble with your work, Helena, the trouble with your work is you're writing about Chicanos. You should be writing about people. Yeah. Isn't that something? Yeah, I know. And so what happened is that, so then I left the program. I remember walking across the parking lot with my stories, 3 of them that were here, and leaving the program. And for the next 25 years, I thought and thought and thought about this statement. What is it that makes my characters not people? What is it about it? And I came to realize a couple of things. This whole idea of universality. People, whenever you teach creative writing, whenever you take classes in creative writing, you always think that you want to make your story universal. Well, what the hell does that mean? Who defines what universal is? One of my students, Manuel Munoz, in the back of his second collection of short stories called The Faith Healer of Olive Avenue. In fact, it was nominated for the Frank O'Connor Book Award, which is a global award. That's how good the second collection is. In the back of it, it says, "Oh, these stories are all about Mexican-American characters, and they're really good, and it can be universal." And I'm going, oh my gosh, it can be universal. Do they do that to John Updike? Do they say, oh, he writes about Anglo people all the time, and it can be universal? No. Only when it's ethnic writers, only when it's writers like myself, that we have to define what universal is. And as creative writers, we're all trained. We're all trained to be culturally specific. So what that advisor was telling me was that I was being so culturally specific that he didn't understand it. Or that because he couldn't understand it, it didn't exist. Mm-hmm. And that's when I told myself, I may never go back to this program again, but damn, I'm going to learn to write well. And I'm going to learn to write well as a political practice, because nobody will ever again insult my people or my family that way, in saying that they're not. So I had to think and think and think a lot about this whole idea of universality. And the only way I thought about it was to use the 5 senses. This is what makes us all universal. Those 5 senses. Seeing, smelling, touching. Some have 3 senses, some have 7 senses. But we all have some senses by which we can share, and that's what makes us universal. So in my world, in the world that I write about, I always try to make it very sensual. Very, very sensual. Now, going back to this whole idea of writing what you know into a place of writing the unknown. For me, I think fiction is as close as I can get to truth. You know? Essays for me is something that I write, but it lays flat. I just tell you things. But with going into the unknown, I'm engaging not only with my own imagination, but I'm also inviting you to be a part of it.
We could take that little clip and talk for an hour or two just about that. One of my favorite writers is Sherman Alexie, Spokane, Coeur d'Alene, and he has a line like this. He says, when critics call something universal, it means white people understand it. That's right, and she's right. White, male, straight, etc., that is the default setting. So if there's no way this could be universal because the default is white and male, etc. And if you hear me from this stage criticize that ideology, it's on purpose. It's because that's my ideology. That's what I grew up with. Maybe you did too. And it was pretty safe, you know. There's a script for you. If you look like me and are like me, you just follow the script. It's kind of nice until it doesn't work anymore. Until you realize that you're missing this. You're missing this, and you're missing voices like this, and these voices are from other worlds that not only involve a deep critique of your own, they're also more beautiful sometimes than your own. And whatever, they're other worlds. Why not explore them? And you explore them by listening. And I love what she said there, how she wants to reach out to you. She wants people to hear and feel the lives of the characters she writes about. And that's a beautiful gift to the world. So much to say here. There's also some trepidation, I know, from people like me about going into these worlds. My scholarship is actually in Native American literature, and it's a very fraught area for a white boy from Tennessee. But I feel fortunate. I never had any trouble writing or speaking about Native American literature because I always saw it as an act of listening. So instead of applying these universal values that were bequeathed to me, I simply tried to listen. And part of listening is responding to the storyteller. And so my work in that area was basically, here's what I'm hearing and here's what I'm learning. And that seemed to be a viable way to go. So I'm really happy to introduce this amazing writer to you tonight. And I should say, this novel, Under the Feet of Jesus, I don't know if it was an editor or someone else who wrote her and said, well, this is great. She read the manuscript and the person said, this is great, but it's missing something. And she said, what? And she said, plot. And you can see this. Viramontes is not that interested in plot. And I understand that why her professor didn't get it, because he wasn't listening or looking in the right way. So we'll see with Their Dogs Came With Them. There's no real narrative line, or there is, but it's broken and hard to follow. And if you were here this summer and we talked about Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony, a Laguna Pueblo writer. This is what often happens when you get writers who are not universal, is you're in a strange and wonderful world where time flows differently, where reality is shaped differently, and it's not comfortable. It's definitely not comfortable. So yes, under the feet of Jesus, she forgot about the plot. So she goes in and writes, adds a layer of plot to it. But so if it's not about plot, what is it about? It's really about, characterization is very important to her. But I would say that's not even the most important thing. I think it's vision. And that comes across as kind of painterly in a way, so that she's painting these scenes. I'm really surprised filmmakers haven't picked up on her, because she writes scenes. She writes filmic scenes with her words. So for example, there's, in Under the Feet of Jesus, the central symbol is this barn. It's migrant families driving through the San Joaquin Valley, and they're looking for a place to work, and they see this barn, this old dilapidated barn, and they're drawn to this barn. It's not being used, and so it's an empty symbol. It's a symbol of absence. It's a symbol of lack. It's a symbol of loss, but they're drawn to it. Well, and here's a line from the novel. The silence in the barn and the clouds meant many things. It was always a question of work, and work depended on the harvest, on the car running, their health, the conditions of the road, how long the money held out, and the weather, which meant they could depend on nothing. Estrella watched Perfecto's hand scratching the back of his head with uncertainty. His skin was like the bark of a juniper tree. Okay, so just that scene, right? You're in it immediately. Even though you don't know what it's like to be a migrant worker, you're there. She brings you there through this painterly, imagistic type of writing. And this is, the main character here is Estrella, who's a young girl, and she's with her stepfather, Perfecto, it's a great name, and her mother and some of her siblings, and they're driving along, like I said, through the San Joaquin Valley, and stop to work in this field. And with Viramontes, there's this, like I said, there's this broken narrative line where in one paragraph you can be in the present, and the next paragraph you're in the past or in the future, and she's not going to lead you through it. You've got to figure it out, which is kind of beautiful and amazing. So here's a reflection, Estrella's reflection. She remembered how one teacher, Mrs. Horn, who had the face of a crumpled Kleenex and a nose like a hook, she did not imagine this, asked how come her mama never gave her a bath. Until then, it had never occurred to Estrella that she was dirty, that the wet towel wiped on her resistant face each morning, the vigorous brushing and tight braids her mother neatly weaved were not enough for Mrs. Horn. And for the first time, Estrella realized words could become as excruciating as rusted nails piercing the heels of her bare feet. Yeah. You know, it's amazing we see this when it comes to contact. We see this over and over, is when Euro-Americans meet people who are not of their heritage, they immediately go to marking difference. Now, some indigenous people did that too, but not as a rule. But invariably, Euro-Americans saw difference. And we can talk about why that is. It has to do with the mythology and the ideology. And so it's a unique disparagement to be called unhygienic. I mean, because it goes to the body, right? And it means you don't care for your body. And sure, there's several lines in these works about what's in the front yards of people, but this isn't in your front yard. This is about you, your body, your smell, your look, your hair. We could do a whole thing on hair, the symbolism of hair. But what the dominant culture will do invariably is find something that either you cannot change, like your skin color or your gender, or something that is just different enough that you can mark it, and by marking it, you make it less. You make it almost inhuman. right? And so imagine a child, and this happens to children especially with the whole boarding school movement for indigenous people here, but it happens in every encounter with difference. Can you imagine being a child and being told this? Like she said, it's as excruciating as rusted nails piercing the heels of her bare feet. Her stepfather, Perfecto, is flawed, but he does teach her some survival skills, and I love this. Perfecto Flores taught her the names that went with the tools. A claw hammer, he said with authority, miming its function. Screwdrivers, see, holding up the various heads and pointing to them. Crescent wrenches, looped pliers like scissors for cutting chicken or barbed wire. Old wood saw, new hacksaw, a sledgehammer, pry bar, chisel, axe, names that gave meaning to the tools. Tools to build, bury, tear down, rearrange, and repair. A box of reasons his hands took pride in. She lifted the pry bar in her hand, felt the coolness of iron and the power of function, weighed the significance it awarded her, and soon she came to understand how essential it was to know these things. That was when she began to read. You see what she did there? There's this wonderful description of a stepfather teaching his stepdaughter, about tools, but for the daughter, it was a lesson in hermeneutics. It was a lesson in interpretation and in power, right? This does that. It's almost like the Genesis story. You can almost go right from there to the Genesis story. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And Perfecto said, this is a saw, and so I cut, right? It's this wonderful act of creation in language. And then what they're doing in these fields is making raisins. So they have grapes, and they have to pick the grapes, put them out on these mesh screens and let them dry. And Estrella she's struck by when she sees the final product in the grocery store. What's that brand of raisins with the red box? Sun-Maid. And the woman with the bonnet. And she just can't get past this. So this is from the novel. Carrying the full basket to the paper, the full basket of raisins, or grapes, was not like the picture on the red raisin boxes Estrella saw in the markets. Not like the woman wearing a fluffy bonnet, holding out the grapes with her smiling ruby lips, the sun a flat orange behind her. The sun was white, and it made Estrella's eyes sting like an onion. And the baskets of grapes resisted her muscles, pulling their magnetic weight back to the earth. The woman with the red bonnet did not know this. Her knees did not sink in the hot white soil, and she did not know how to pour the baskets of grapes inside the frame gently and spread the bunches evenly on top of the newsprint paper. She did not remove the frame, straighten her creaking knees, the bend of her back, set down another sheet of newsprint paper, reset the frame, then return to the pisca again with the empty basket, row after row, sun after sun. The woman's bonnet would be as useless as Estrella's own straw hat under a white sun so mighty it toasted the green grapes to black raisins. And her brother. This is another interesting passage I like because there are these dreams of marginalized people and they're the same dreams as the dominant culture, because that's the story that's being told, that's the story that's being adopted and assimilated. And here is her brother wanting to be like other boys. He planned to buy a canvas backpack to carry his books once he could go to school, a pencil sharpener, a bobcat book cover, and planned to major in geology after graduating. He loved stones and the history of stones. because he believed himself to be a solid mass of boulder thrust out of the earth, and not some particle lost in infinite and cosmic space. With a simple touch of a hand and a hungry wonder of his connection to it all, he not only became a part of the earth's history, but would exist as the boulders did for eternity. Now, of course, there's much irony in that desire, because if he studies geology, he will not learn that, because that's not a mythology, it's a science. And it's going to teach you very useful and important stuff like geology, but what he needs is a mythology, which he's not going to find. And I don't know, there's a Native American poet, Lewis, I forget his name, sorry. Adrian Lewis, I think is his name. He says, he has this line, "There is something about Indians and trains." And there is, and there's something about, I think, indigenous people or migrant people and trains, and there's this line stuck out to me. So they're in the San Joaquin Valley, by the way. "The lone train broke the sun in silence with its growing thunderous roar, and the train reminded the pescadores of destinations and arrivals and departures, of home and not of home, for they did stop and listen." I love that beautiful symbol there, a calling to what is home and not home. And then, of course, there is the Border Patrol. Estrella gathered her knife and basket. She startled when the sheets of high-powered lights beamed on the playing field like the headlights of cars, blinding her. The round, sharp white lights burned her eyes, and she made a feeble attempt to shield them with an arm. The Border Patrol, she thought, and she tried to remember which side she was on and which side of the wire mesh she was safe in. The floodlights aimed at the phantoms in the field, or were the lights directed at her? That's always the question when you get pointed out, right? Could the spectators see her from where she stood? She snuck off to watch a ball game. Where was home? A ball hit a blunt instrument against a skull. A player ran the bases for the point. A score, destination, home plate. Who would catch the peach? Who was hungry enough to run the field in all that light? The perfect target, the luscious peach. The element of surprise, a stunned deer waiting for the bullet. A few of the spectators applauded. Estrella fisted her knife and ran, her shadow fading into the approaching night. I will never know what that feeling is like, but I know a little bit now, thanks to this description, how she merges the ball game, which is an innocuous, even a vacuous hunting game is really what it is, or it's about territory, about getting home. Do you know George Carlin's piece on football versus baseball? It just popped. You should check that out. Football is militaristic, baseball is pastoral. It's funny, because in baseball you go home, but in football you go into the end zone, and you drop bombs. Anyway, I won't do George Carlin. Only George Carlin can do George Carlin. Anyway, so the barn plays a very important part at the end, and it's even an epiphany of sorts. So listen to this language. The roof, she's on the barn. The roof tilted downward, and she felt gravity pulling, but did not lose her footing. The termite softened shakes crunched beneath her bare feet, like the serpent under the feet of Jesus. I should explain that the family, a migrant family, and they're moving around a lot, but they keep a few items to make home, right? And one of these is a statue of Jesus, and they keep their papers there under the feet of Jesus, because that's where you want it. That's the safest place, right? Under the feet of Jesus. for your papers, which you will be asked for invariably. The termite softened shakes crunched beneath her bare feet like the serpent under the feet of Jesus. And a few pieces tumbled down and over the edge of the barn. No longer did she feel her blouse damp with sweat. No longer did she stumble blindly. She had to trust the soles of her feet, her hands, the shovel of her back, and the pounding bells of her heart. Her feet brushed close to the edge of the roof, and it was there that she stopped. A breeze fluttered a few loose strands of hair on her face, and nothing had ever seemed as pleasing to her as this. Some of the birds began descending, cautiously at first, then in groups, and finally a few swallows flapped to their nests not far from where she stood. Estrella remained as immobile as an angel, standing on the verge of faith. Like the chiming bells of the great cathedrals, she believed her heart powerful enough to summon home all those who had strayed. You will see this often in Viramontes' work, these epiphanic moments, these moments of epiphany, of dense and deep symbolism that are, well, they're epiphanic, they're epiphanies. Not necessarily for the characters, sometimes for the characters, but mostly for the reader. For the reader. So she will bring you through the dirt of the fields and the fright of the border patrol, but she invariably brings you to something transcendent, like that scene. Now, this is an amazing novel. Their dogs came with them. Her most recent novel. It's set in East LA, where she grew up, a neighborhood that's isolated from the rest of the city by a network of freeways, bridges, and cemeteries, by the way, over there. Housing is dense, and noise, pollution, violence of urban and industrial life create a kind of toxic ecology for the poor, abandoned, and often the feared characters in this novel. The novel's set in East LA in 1960. The year that LA County began bulldozing parts of the neighborhood to lay concrete for freeways, and in 1970, when the LA County Sheriff imposed curfews to stall the Chicano moratorium, excuse me, which was another movement kind of born out of the education movement opposing the Vietnam War. So the curfews targeted Chicano student activists, of course. And the novel's characters are constantly under siege by violent policing and general dehumanization of their setting. In the novel, she creates this rationale for the government to act, in that any dog that is not chained into a yard is shot on sight because of a fear of rabies, or a rabies prevention initiative, which of course isn't the reason, because the reason given by a powerful institution is never the reason. It's always a lie. It has to be, because an institution does not exist for the sake of the people. It exists for the sake of the institution. And the only driving force of an institution is the continued existence of the institution. And yet it must have a face that appears to the public as, at least, if not benign, at least rational. And so her creation here of the rabies patrol is brilliant, because it invokes the sense of dogs again, but also the danger of dogs and people who would keep rabid dogs. Like, who wants to keep a rabid dog around? But they're not rabid, they're just not housed. and the metaphors expand. So, she writes in the novel, from First Street to Boyle to Whittier and back to Pacific Boulevard, roadblocks enforced a quarantine to contain a potential outbreak of rabies. And anyone living in the quarantine zone had to remain indoors after dark. Pardon me. Well, that's it. The Quarantine Authority, the QA, goes on air and foot patrol shooting undomesticated animals. And indeed, that's the right word, undomesticated. So she always gives voice to women, and in fact, The Dogs Came With Them has 4 main female characters. There is Tranquilina, really interesting character, a devout person who had come to LA after being raped in a religious service in Texas. Brutal depiction of the rape. She's forced down into the ground, and she describes tasting the dirt as he violates her. Survival of this brutal rape, she cannot get the taste of that dirt out of her mouth. And she describes the man as smelling like manure. And if you've ever been to Amarillo, Texas, it smells like manure. So Tranquilina has a really interesting story because she has a religious heritage, not the one she's adopted, not her Catholic heritage, but something much older. And that is her father tells the story of her birth. He and her mother were crossing the border, and they were in trouble. The mother was pregnant with Tranquilina, and she's not doing well. And the border patrol is everywhere, and they're surely going to get caught, and the child is about to be born any minute. It's a very dire situation. And her father reconnects with his Aztec heritage. He's a very lanky, thin man with light bones, it is said. And he finds a way to fly over the border patrol and see the way. And there's much made of this being part of Aztec culture, these kinds of figures in Aztec culture and mythology who can, they're heroes, of course, because they can find the way by transcending the ground. And this happens, and it occasions the birth of Tranquilina. So remember that, we're going to come back to that. Her father drew on these ancestral forces to scout for water and safe passage. And she doesn't know what to do with this because she's been raped at a religious service, and then she tries to maintain this religious mythology. But she was born as a result of an older mythology. So says her parents. And so, do I believe my parents? What is this? The classic question of belief. Should I believe in this miracle, or is there a rational explanation? She, regardless, she finds herself serving the outcasts of Los Angeles. And this is the way she deals with this conflicted religious heritage she has. She just tries to feed people and take care of them. There is Ermelia Zumaya, who is herself a political figure. There is Anna, who works in an office and struggles to take care of her baby brother, Ben. And then there is Antonia Gamboa, who's a young female gang member known as Turtle, and she passes as male. You will not be surprised that Tranquilina and Turtle are the more interesting characters in the novel. Turtle especially is, well, let me just give you some sense of Turtle here. So the title is very interesting, and the epigraph to the novel is from Miguel Leon Portilla in his book, The Broken Spears, The Aztec Conquest of Mexico, 1961, I think. And he writes this of of Cortez and his soldiers. They came in battle array as conquerors, and as the dust rose in whirlwinds on the roads, their spears glinted in the sun, and their pennants fluttered like bats. They made a loud clamor as they marched, for their coats of mail and their weapons clashed and rattled. Some of them were dressed in glistening iron from head to foot. They terrified everyone who saw them. Their dogs came with them, running ahead of the column. They raised their muzzles high. They lifted their muzzles to the wind. They raced on before with saliva dripping from their jaws. And you should know, if you don't, that this was a fairly common feature of conquistadors, the Spanish who came to the Americas. Their dogs did come with them, and they were used to kill indigenous people. De Soto, coming up the Mississippi, has some pretty horrific accounts of this. They would just let these dogs loose and tear up, especially the children, to subsume, to conquer the indigenous people. So dogs themselves are pretty powerful symbols to marginalized people, as are bulldozers to the characters, and their dogs came with them. This is an older character in the novel reflecting. I do remember a time when there weren't any freeways, and then I do remember the neighborhood, whole city blocks abandoned, then chewed up. Our neighbors disappeared. It devastated, amputated East LA from the rest of the city. The bulldozers resembled the conqueror's ships coming to colonize a second time, and I felt a real desire to portray the lives of those who disappeared. I think that's actually Viramontes writing that. My apologies. That's her writing that. I felt a real desire to portray the lives of those who disappeared. This would be the construction of the 60, the Pomona Freeway, by the way. And then, I don't know of a novel quite like this. The novel, like I said, does not follow a linear narrative line or any real narrative line. Plot is hard to find, but there is structure to it, and it's the structure of the freeways. She said, and she didn't realize this until she was writing it, she says this: I realized that the structure of the novel began to resemble the freeway intersections. And like freeways upheld by pillars, I realized I had 4 pillars and 4 characters, of which most of the other characters orbited around. Isn't that fascinating? Try writing a novel based on a freeway. See how good you are at it. She says the list of characters kept increasing, and there are a lot of characters. The stories multiplied like freeway interchanges. And having this eureka moment, she says, I realized that the structure of the novel was that of freeway intersections. And again, she has young female protagonists here. There are men in the novels, but the centers of the stories are young female protagonists. And this is what she calls a geography of pain and loss, East LA, especially in the 60s and 70s with the building of the freeways. And if you've ever been there, you know it's like a wall. You can literally see how these neighborhoods were cut off, and we'll hear some of that too. So this is from an article by Alicia Munoz on the novel. During the 1950s and 60s, the communities of East LA were burdened with the construction of 7 freeways. I didn't realize this, 7. The social and political ramifications of these structures prompted Rodolfo Acuna to describe the community as under siege. The new corridors cut through the city, devouring 12% of the land, exacerbating the housing shortage and disrupting local businesses. Demographic changes followed the physical disruption, displacing 10% of the community's residents and creating racial pockets subdivided by the freeways, themselves lined by insulating high walls. The scars of this so-called progress would remain with the community for generations. And of all the stories of LA, this is one we cannot ignore. This displacement for the sake of progress, which is a synonym for greed, right? Feel comfortable saying that. All right, let's get into Turtles and some of the other characters' worlds just a little bit, and then we'll finish up. She could read. Turtle wasn't stupid. The cross-outs, tags, new gang emblems. She's in a gang herself, passing as a man. New gang emblems thrashed all over the McBride's, that was the game, the McBride Street gang. All over McBride's graffiti on the walls of the bridge, all bad news. The calligraphic tags, Alfonso, AKA Big Al, Sir Santos, Pablo, Lucho, Turtle, the McBride boys. This is her gang. This is her gang, and she's terrified of her own gang. And I love this description. Again, I can't relate to it except mainly through Viramontes' brilliant descriptions, but when we lived in in downtown LA for many years, and I walked it. I've walked all over downtown LA, and this resonates with me because there are borders and boundaries and changes, dramatic changes that happen within a block. This is Turtle. Turtle knew how to work the streets, how to avoid the quarantine authority who enforced the curfew, how to hide from the Lot-M homeboys, that's the other gang, and mostly how to keep away from her own McBride boys. Again, Alicia Munoz writes, by communicating Los Angeles through the impediments to Turtle's movements. That's fascinating, right? Walk around and watch the impediments you have. Watch the impediments that you have that I don't have. There are places I can go that you can't go, and there are places I can go and you can't go, or vice versa. Viramontes draws attention to the realities of oppressive governmental forces as well as dangerous non-governmental authorities originating from within the community, gangs. Mike Davis writes quite a bit about this, about what LA development has done, none of it good. Here's another example of Turtle walking. These are my favorite sections of the novels, Turtle walking, because she's got to navigate everything. She's standing by a newspaper stand at one point, and a guy comes up to get a newspaper, and she's got to navigate this guy. You know, and he seems like a nice guy. He just wants to get a paper, but she's standing in the way, and she ends up kicking his ass. He didn't do anything, but that's how you have to navigate these streets if you're Turtle, a woman passing as a gang member, as a male gang member. Up the darkened path of a hillside driveway was the entrance to Sybil Brand Institute for Women, nestled like a natural outcropping of granite up high on one of the hills. She crossed the street to avoid the entrance, but felt the mist of sorrow like a ghost late at night. Turtle walked in haste, the zoom of dreary cars passing houses and makeshift fences, and every once in a while she passed a fellow pedestrian who tottered home from a swing shift. Every so often a dog tied to a porch pillar would bark at her shadow, tipping over its pie plate or spilling a Cool Whip water dish. Barked so that the porch lights switched on and off, and neighboring eyes made security checks for possible escapees from prison. Once Turtle reached the top of the hill, she spotted a column of lights surrounding a university parking lot across the great divide of the Interstate 10 freeway. The fuzzy glow of lights against the blank night seemed as distant to Turtle as the glare of the moon. Right? So it's this fascinating description of what's immediate, right? Like what's right next to you and what's far off that you can see but can never reach. And this is Anna searching for her brother Ben. Ben is a, really, really powerful and profound and poignant character. He's, when he was young, he was in a department store downtown, and he was kind of lost. He'd never been really in a shopping center, and he catches the eye of a young boy a little bit younger than him, and they just want to play. So in that language, unspoken language of childhood, they see each other, and they just kind of nod, and they're often running, and they're having fun, and they go outside, and the boy is hit by a truck and dies. And the rest of Ben's life from that point on, I think he was 10 or 11, is dealing with this, and he doesn't deal with it. He deteriorates more and more, and so he's become institutionalized. But his sister, Anna, takes care of him, and she's trying to find him. She might think it unsafe to search for Ben at night, and this dread deepened Anna's anxiety, which was why she risked taking the Pomona 60 West in the first place. She grasped the steering wheel, dented the moistness of her palms with her polished nails, and turned left after clearing the quarantine authority checkpoint. On Soto Street, she caught the 5 freeway entrance, and in her freeway savvy, knew that this would hook her up to the 60. Anna had maintained a driving strive onto the multiple lane freeway until the cars were trapped in files of gridlock, stuck behind the bumper of a mammoth Mayflower moving truck and unable to see what was ahead. Anna tired of seeing the driver on her left picking his nose, the driver to the right applying lipstick on her mouth. Motorcycle riders, mere flashes in her rearview mirror, slalomed in between the stalled, throbbing stoppage of cars. Hundreds, thousands filed in neat rows. The cars and trucks began to crowd her until a wild impatience moved her to set her signaling blinkers on and aim the car in a crawl toward the closest runaway exit out of the 60 West. Done that? Yeah. The city buildings, I think this is a continuation to the same passage. The city buildings, once brightly speckled with fashionable, neatly creased people. This is actually downtown, if you've been downtown. Especially a few years ago when people would go downtown to work and then they would flee, right? The city buildings, once brightly speckled with fashionable, neatly creased people, were now deserted as night fell on the streets of downtown, and more people like her squeezed out of the crawl spaces and the crevices of the alleys. At sundown, war was declared between the haves who abandoned their office buildings for home and the have-nots who pushed their portable cardboard homes and shopping carts to reclaim a place in the streets denied them during daylight. Dogs emerged, packs of them gathering in a number as they roamed the streets to scavenge to challenge the have-nots. And then continuing this really interesting relationship between the freeway and the streets, and between driving and walking. She exited and ended up in an unfamiliar city block of boarded up warehouses. One radio song, then 2, then commercial blather. Anna still remained lost in the maze of downtown streets. She drove beneath the overpass at the edges of a no man's land where a single eucalyptus tree stood tall and slight, an anomaly of true nature. Otherwise, the deserted area revealed a congealed remnants of squatters like scabs on a wound. Ben-like people, like her brother, bequeathing cold and blackened wood chips to campfires, abandoned makeshift cardboard beds, forsaken newspapers. They squirreled away bundles of clothes or bottles collected for deposit money inside the concrete catacomb of pillar and girder. Everywhere Ben appeared, which means nowhere. She never found him. The 101. Interesting scene here where Anna is looking for Ben and she comes to the 101. If the woman stood on a pedestrian bridge, and she's contemplating this difference between the driver, she's in her car, and a pedestrian. If a woman stood on a pedestrian bridge overlooking the Hollywood 101 freeway, let's say, one would think that the woman who was not old entertained the idea of suicide, and the driver would maintain a diligent vigil from the rearview mirror. Could the driver know what the woman thought? In order to envision her life, one would have to think of her with greater generosity. It would be too easy to simply imagine her existence as horrendous and therefore think of suicide as the only option left for such a pitiful soul. Yet life is stratified layers of time, a complex gut of pulsating misery. One would need much more than obvious assumptions in order for the driver to turn off the ignition key, set the parking brake right, and ask about her. One would have to be close enough to look into her eyes, jump into the trunk of her heart, lift the stage curtains to see behind her props. It was one thing to assume, another to conjure, and yet another to feel for this person on the bridge. One would need metaphor to love her. One would need metaphor to love her, indeed. Whole residential blocks had been gutted. This is a couple people coming back after being away. Whole residential blocks had been gutted since their departure, and they soon discovered that Kern Street abruptly dead-ended, forcing them to retrace their trail. The streets Mama remembered had once connected to other arteries of the city, rolling up and down hills and in and out of neighborhoods where neighbors of different nationalities intersected with one another. And then at the end here, you'll not be surprised that Turtle does not end well. But there is Tranquilina, who is trying to stop the quarantine authority and the LAPD and all the other authorities who have come to break up this gang fight between the Lode-M boys and the McBride Street boys. Tranquilina, the religious person, the saint even, the victim of rape, the person touched by God or the gods. She screams out to the authorities, "We're not dogs." Tranquilina roared in the direction of the shooters. "Stop shooting, we're not dogs." The words crashed into one another, rocketing into one big howl of pleading, demanding, a speeding blur of raging language blending in with the chaos of commands and shouts and orders and circus-like commotion coming from the shooters who stood in the darkness. And then this is what happens. Remember Tranquilina's father. His heritage is that of those men in Aztec culture who are made of lizard skin and bird bones. Tranquilina closed her eyes to hear her heart beating. She summoned the stories of Papa and Mama's miraculous escape. Shoulders back, Tranquilina raised her chin higher, as Mama had told her time and again, to fill up with the embrace of ancestral spirits. The rain on her face cleansed away the grievous exhaustion, and she ignored the command to place her hands on her head. Her arms by her side, her fist clenched, she would not fear them. Shouting voices ordered her not to move, to stay immobile, but she lifted one foot forward, then another, refusing to halt. 2 inches, 4, 6, 8, riding the currents of the wilding wind, riding it beyond the borders, past the Caesarean scars of the earth, out to limitless space where everything was possible if she believed. And that is the end of the dog. Their dogs came with them. Thank you for your attention.